What I'm going to do here, try to give a macro perspective to understand the Armenian genocide. I have a new argument for you. This is maybe where I ended up after 30 years research on Armenian genocide. Armenian genocide has been debated for the most part as a phenomenon that occurred between the years of 1915 and 18. Naturally, the historical roots were discussed, and there were different explanations for the causes, but at the end, the point of the discussion was to understand what had occurred between 1915 and 18. In other words, the genocide was taken up and debated as an event and an occurrence that took place between 1915 and 18. What I want to do here is something different. I propose that we use the concept of genocide not to describe an event that took between 1915 and 18, but as a process that started in 1878 and in one respect was concluded by 1923 by Lausanne Agreement. Genocide not as an occurrence, but as a process. The theoretical background goes to Lemkin, historian Lemkin. Maybe in question and answer period, we can discuss more on that aspect. No doubt dates have symbolic significance and that can be pulled in either directions. I want to use the 1878 Treaty of Berlin as the start date because of the Article 61, and the Armenian problem became an undeniable piece of international diplomacy, and from that day forward, the great powers were not only active players, they were part of the problem, and they were also the one who determined which direction it took. Another significance of 1878, for my purpose, is that from that year onward, the issue started to be called Armenian reform question. Please write it down, Armenian reform question. This description provides us with the main characteristic of the period and the problem. Armenian problem as a reform, as a question of reform. So what I'm suggesting here is a very simple idea. The Armenian problem should be understood and debated as a matter of reforms that covered the period from 1878 to 1923. This period could be described within three different frameworks that are correlated with each other. These three separate context frameworks corresponded to the three different sides of Armenian reform question. First context is that the Armenian genocide is not a standalone event that involved the Armenians alone. It must be treated as one part of the policies that were implemented towards other Christian communities, both before and after 1878 by the Ottoman government. After 1878, the Macedonian crisis of the early 20th century, the ethnic cleansing of the Greeks, Rum population of the Thrace and Aegean region following the Balkan War of 1912, the Assyrian genocide during the First World War, the genocide of Pontus Greeks of the Black Sea during 1921-22, the burning of Smyrna, Izmir in 1922, and the 1924 Turkish-Greek population exchange are among the most well-known events of this era. If the Armenian genocide is taken up as one part of the policies implemented against the Christian population, it becomes comprehensible. It would be appropriate to define the period between 1878 and 1923 as the period of Ottoman genocide. This is the term that we started using in our research, to which the Armenian genocide constitutes only one part of it. Within this context, the demographic policies implemented during the years 1913 and 18 played an instrumental role. What was driving these policies was an attempt to rescue the empire rather than to establish a Turkish nation state. The empire that was on the verge of the collapse and falling apart, and by homogenizing around a collective identity called Turkish Islamic synthesis, the empire was to be saved or tried to be saved by Committee of Union and Progress Party. They want to prevent the dismemberment of the empire. I think this is an interesting theory for you, not that the CUP targeted not to establish a nation state, but their policy was within the empire context, it can be understood. So Then within that policy, the two fundamental pillars was of this homogenization, the cultural Turkishness that still maintained a connection with Islam and a Sunni interpretation of it. And for that reason, homogenization aimed not only the removal of Christians through forced expulsion and annihilation, but also the deportation and assimilation of non-Turkish Muslims. During the 1913-18 period, Bosnians, Arabs, Kurds, and Circassian other non-Turkish Muslim population were also relocated and settled in different places, and the term assimilation was used by Ottoman authorities themselves. This is not the term that I'm making up. Their purpose was to assimilate these small other ethnic groups, non-Turkish Muslims, within Turkish majority. This is the policy that they implemented. And as a result of this demographic policy of 1913-18, the ethnic makeup of Anatolia has been completely changed. The estimate 17 million people of Anatolia were so uprooted that by the end of the period, at least 1/3 of this population had been resettled elsewhere, deported or annihilated. The establishment of modern Turkey was possible as a result of these demographic policies implemented during First World War years. Second context pertains to the massacre directly targeted the Armenians, without wanting to ignore the massacres that occurred elsewhere, like Sassoon 1904-5, you may never heard about it, and Maraş 1921. This period, 3 huge massacres occurred during 1878-1923. One is the what we call it Abdülhamit massacres, 1894-96. Approximately 200,000 Armenians were massacred, and the Adana massacre of 1909, approximately 20,000 Armenians were massacred, and the genocide of 1915-18, approximately 1 million Armenians were massacred during that period. And up until now, these 3 large massacres were examined independently of each other as unique singular phenomena. No one had tried to interpret these 3 events by looking through the same window. This is what I'm going to do here for you. Of course, there have been some very good attempts at explanation which have described both 1894, 96, and 1909 massacres as preparation, rehearsal for or precursor of the genocide of 1915-18. In the early genocide literature, these events, 1894 or Adana 1909, was considered as rehearsal for the Armenian genocide. In these studies, however, the one thing that connected all 3 massacres was an abstract actor or agent, the Turk, and some characteristic that we attributed to them as the causes of the massacres. These characteristics were searched within culture, ideology, or mentality. So I'm quoting some quotes from the authors. The quotes doesn't belong to me. In this approach, such concept, a subculture of massacre, or the Ottoman Turkish propensity to resolve acute conflict by resorting to violence. These are quotes. Or as well as statement like, quote, Islamic doctrines and traditions embodied an inherent resistance to change. So occupied these ideas in important role, putting in a simplistic way, the religion of Islam, the prevalence of militaristic culture among the Turks, or expansionist ideologies like Pan-Turanism and Pan-Islamism were put forth as root causes of the genocide. I'm ready to accept these types of method of explanation, which can be called essentialist actually in nature, can provide us with some important clues that might help us to understand the behavior of just one of the actors in the process, main perpetrator group. However, I would like to state that these studies that describe the period by putting the intention and the motivation of one actor who performs the act, it's called ahistorical. It is not really a historical analysis of the period. What I'm proposing is an explanation of these 3 massacres which doesn't rely on only the intention of motivation of a single actor, namely the Turks, but rather that one puts the Armenian reform question front and center, connects all these massacres together, and includes two other actors in the process, in addition to the Ottoman rulers, Armenian reform movements, separate branches of it, and the great powers. So they too were active in this process. We would need to add here, of course, the dynamic relations in the locals, Circassians, Kurds, and so on, in order to extend the scope. But all these three massacres, 1894, 1909, and 1915-18, came about as a result of the common denominator of the dynamic relations of these actors. Throughout the entire process, the one thing that distinguished the relation between the actors was their different position that they took on the Armenian reform question. Despite certain differences in ideological preferences or social class roots, the massacre occurred as the common response of Ottoman Turkish rulers, both sultans and the CUP party leaders. So, and one additional important issue I don't have time to discuss, but the Armenian reform movement were not passive receivers in that process. They were also active participants in that process, and this gives it a dynamic process. The critical case here is the Adana massacre of 1909, and whether or not really we should put the Adana massacre within that context. There are debates and discussion, but my argument is we have to put Adana as a bridge between 1894, 96, and 1915, and this is the continuity on the reform question. Why Adana is so important on the reform question? Maybe this is a revelation for the historians. Nobody knew until recently that there were indeed another reform package in Ottoman Parliament, 1909, before Adana massacre. So this is an interesting other topic that must be discussed. So the third context, this is the, to unite all these three big massacres on the axis of Armenian reform question is something that has to be done and researched truly. The third context interprets the Armenian genocide as part of the history of collapse of the four large empires of Europe. By this process, which started in the mid of 19th century, which came to head in 1918, the German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman Empire collapsed. The struggle for nation-states within each of these empires, fed by French Revolution, played an important role in this collapse. Each of these empires tried to suppress the nationalist movement within their own territories, nevertheless fanned the flames of the similar movement in rival empires. And the nationalist movement in each empire turned into the direct subject of power struggle between different empires. Among these empires, the Ottomans ended up being the most vulnerable and were exposed and defenseless to foreign meddling due to their weakness. The large-scale power struggles between empires devastated the equilibrium of the Ottomans. The most visible reason behind the meddling was to ameliorate the conditions of the Ottoman Christians. The most common expression that was used during the frequent meetings, I'm quoting from the diplomatic reports, quote, to give security and content to the Christians by obtaining for them a fair share in the Ottoman administration, end quote. This is from the diplomatic reports that they used. It was because of the Islamic institutional makeup of the state, as well as the effect of the Islamic culture, whereby Muslims did not see Christians as equal to themselves, the Ottomans could not formulate a way to bring Christians into equal status with Muslims. The actual framework that determined the foreign intervention was less about humanitarian concern and more about calculated based upon realpolitik by the great powers. And I have a new theory here also, not the theory, but new approach. They viewed, the European great powers viewed the problems of Ottoman state with its Christian as a part of European security. this is, again, if you read the diplomatic correspondence very carefully, you will see that they considered Ottomans' problems with Christians as a part of European security. So they believed if the Ottomans did not find a solution to their problems with its Christians, it could turn into an internal conflict within Europe in short order. Security concerns in Europe were one of the biggest justifications for intervention. What happened was, and with the beginning of the Greek uprising 1821, we have a new concept in Europe. This is what we use today, humanitarian intervention. Humanitarian intervention as a term in international diplomacy entered in the arena with the Greek uprising. And throughout 19th century, great powers justified their intervention with the term of humanitarian intervention. And this is what considered by Christians as the liberation from Ottoman yoke, and by the Ottomans, it was considered a threat to their own national security. So my central argument is there was an accumulated knowledge, this is the term that I'm using, accumulated knowledge that really shaped the mindset of the Ottomans, which based on the four-pronged, namely these are the four-pronged pattern: reform, demands, massacre, intervention, and secession. This is the history of 19th century. Christians asked reforms, Ottomans suppressed organized massacres, great powers humanitarian intervention, ended with secession of Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, Romania, and so on. So this is the accumulated knowledge which has based on these four-pronged pattern. And then Ottoman Christians' demand for the reforms become caught between the screws of European internal security and the Ottoman perception of being under threat. When 1913, after the Balkan War, Armenians asked the reforms. Negotiations started 1913 summer months. And for this negotiation, Armenian reform negotiation, they took 1895 May reform proposal as their basis. When they signed 1914 February, the reform agreement, it was clear for Ottomans it is the beginning of the end for them. This is four-pronged: reforms, massacre, intervention, secession. They thought it is the beginning of an independent Armenian state. What I'm here going to tell you and finalize my talk is actually Talat Pasha's telegram or letter. So what I propose here has nothing to do with my own ideas. These are actually a summary of a letter written by Talat as interior minister to Ottoman government dated May 26, 1915. In his statement, Talat describes the reason for the Armenian deportations of 1915. According to him, quote, again, it's not my quote, Armenian reform question, he says, opened the way for the intervention by great powers, which would inevitably result in the partition of Ottoman territory, and the purpose of the deportation was to prevent the intervention of great powers. So, quoting Talat, so as the question of reform, which is completely internal matter of the Ottoman state, has now become an international question as a result of the intervention of the foreign countries. And with some of the Ottoman provinces now passing under foreign influence, it is demanded that certain concessions be granted and that a special administrative organization be created. Nevertheless, Talat continues, since it has been seen through bitter experience 19th century, that reforms and organizations that are created under foreign influence and pressure have led to the dividing and partition of the Ottoman homeland, end quote. Talat relates in that long letter another revelation for us. He says that before the start of the war, underline, before start of the First World War. Quote from Talat, "Deliberations were underway as to how to prepare and implement the means for eliminating this trouble, Armenian reform question, which represent an important section in the list of vital questions of the Ottoman state, in a manner that is both comprehensive and absolute," end quote. According to Talat, since the war had broken out, they had to make do with certain provisional measures, but now, in May 1915, the time come to give the problem, quote, "an orderly manner of arrangement in accordance with appropriate procedures and principles," end quote. As can be seen, the decision driving the Armenian genocide were not directly related to the exigencies of First World War. Rather, they were directly the result of seeking a solution to the Armenian reform question, which was considered a huge thorn in the side of the Ottomans that had gone on for the better part of the 19th century up to that point. So the aim was to prevent the intervention of the great powers and perceive the inevitable secession of yet more territory from the empire. For this reason, what I'm saying is that the only way to understand Armenian genocide, if we examine it as not as a single event, as a process, and as an Armenian reform question, and on these three different levels that I described above. Thank you very much for listening.